everybody. Welcome to the Masters Conference webinar event on blockchain technology and the impact on the legal community, brought to you today by the Masters Conference. My name is Kevin Clark, and I'm an attorney in Dallas, Texas, and I run the litigation support department at Thompson Knight. And I will be the host for today's program. We will be getting started with today's program in just a minute, but before we begin, just a few program details. I'd like to remind you that today's program is being recorded, and we will be providing a free copy to registered attendees about 48 hours after the event. A link will be emailed out after the event. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the program by typing them into the Q&A fields, and your questions will be answered by the panelists either during the presentation or at the end or following up after the presentation. And a little more housekeeping, some webinar ground rules. Content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Questions posed by and opinions offered by participants are for the sole purpose of improving our educational value and do not constitute legal advice. The views expressed by the members of the panel belong solely to the panelists themselves and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of their organizations. And lastly, there are no bad questions. Again, we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to type your question into the Q&A fields, and we will try to get to them if we can. Now on to our program. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, James Sherer. James, to you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Yes, and welcome. So for those of you out there in Zoom land who had attorney trapped in the basement on your Zoom bingo card, you're welcome. You can mark that one off right away. My name is James Sherer. Despite appearances, I am in fact a partner with Baker Hostetler in New York, and I co-chair our emerging tech team. I work with Rob on that team, and we are, kind of in the throes of all the newer technology you might think. So we're constantly being asked by our clients about things that are cutting or bleeding edge, or occasionally get the question, is this all a bunch of hype? Do I have to worry about this? And what should I do? That's when I turn the hard questions over to Rob, who is going to introduce himself right now. And then we'll go around the circle and tell you about our backgrounds, and then we'll dive right into the presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Musiala. I co-lead the blockchain legal practice at Baker Hostetler, along with James. I have been working with blockchain since 2012. I started out in the consulting world. Originally learned about Bitcoin through my work as a financial crimes investigator, and then have done a lot of solution building along the way. So I like to say that I've been involved in the industry from both what I call the dark side and the bright side being solution building, which we'll talk about today. I've been with Baker Hostetler for over 2 years, leading the blockchain legal practice, where we deal with a variety of different legal issues related to blockchain, everything from data privacy and security to tax to securities, anti-money laundering, and issues around blockchain enterprise consortia, to name a few. So that's a little bit about me.
All right, I'm going to toss it to Debbie next for her introduction, and then we'll get to Steve, assuming he's still around outdoors.
Great, thanks, James. My name is Debbie Hoffman. I'm the founder and CEO of Symmetry Blockchain Advisors. I've been an attorney for all of my career, 20 plus years in financial services. I primarily have worked in the mortgage supply chain, and that is what got me interested in the blockchain technology field because of the way that there's disjointed parties in a supply chain that all are producing the same product in the end that gets sold to the secondary market. So it got me fascinated with blockchain and how it can cause efficiencies in supply chains across all different industries. My expertise, however, is in financial services, primarily in mortgage and in some applications within the legal field itself.
James, you're on mute, but I believe you're going to be passing it over to me, so I will just take it from there. So I'm Steve Mickelson. I am the General Counsel at 3 Degrees Group, Inc. We are a renewable energy and carbon trading and advisory firm. So we enter into energy and energy product transactions all around the world, and we are always looking at new and more efficient ways of trading those products and getting our customers what it is they need. And through that process, it's led 3 Degrees to become a member of the Energy Web Foundation, which is a Swiss foundation which is seeking to build a blockchain-enabled platform for energy trading in Europe, which potentially may be able to be scaled abroad. And so that has been the impetus for our blockchain desire. And through that, I've worked with the ABA and was one of the primary authors of last year, the ABA's Digital and Digitized Assets Jurisdictional White Paper, which covers how digital and digital assets such as tokens, blockchain tokens, are regulated all around the world. And then this summer, we're actually working on an update to that white paper. Thank you.
All right, with that, and again, those of you who are playing bingo, you're welcome for me being muted and having to be told to unmute. I'm gonna cover all the bases today. Steve, tell me more, and certainly to our panelists, about the fact pattern. So in preparation for today's panel, we were talking about different potential applications, and certainly from your perspective as, let's say, a client, that would be working with Rob and working with Debbie on trying to look at potential solutions for issues. I think you have some opportunities that might work here. So lay out the foundation for us. Tell us what your concerns are, what you want to accomplish, and then we're going to let Debbie explain where she can support those things and what the experience is. And then Rob's going to shoot it all down as all good in-law firm attorneys do.
Sounds good, and thank you, James. And so, 3 Degrees, as I described, we transact all sorts of intangible environmental commodities. And like a lot of businesses, there are a whole bunch of different supply chain interactions that go with the party who is producing the product, in our case, a generator of electricity, all the way to the end user who may have a need for electricity or some sort of a compliance credit, neither to meet a regulatory obligation or perhaps to be able to meet some sort of an internal sustainability obligation. And one of the issues that we have, since we're all over the world, is these markets where these products are transacted are very balkanized. So the way we do things in California is different than what they do in Texas, which is different than what they do in New York, which is different than what they do abroad. And so to the extent that there is a technological solution that could help us to get our product or someone else's product to our customer in an efficient way, in which instead of having everyone else having to log into these different balkanized solutions, maybe there's a platform that would perhaps fit on top of all of that might make types of transactions more efficient, thereby making it a little bit easier for parties to do the things they already want to do.
So Debbie, is this something that's going to make that easier? I mean, do you see at least the potential for a solution here and or have experience from clients that have done something similar?
So at first glance, it appears that it definitely could be right for blockchain technology. So what I would ask then is the type of information that the parties in your are using.
All right, Debbie. I think Debbie's breaking up a little bit, so we're gonna check that off of our checklist.
Okay. Okay.
Right. And let's toss it over to Rob, and then come back to Debbie, and she'll also make sure that she enters info into the chat for us so we can convey the thoughts too. So Rob.
Steve, it's a very good fact pattern, and while specific to the energy industry, it's not uncommon to a lot of different industries that are looking at potential blockchain solutions. When I try to unpack these issues, I really kind of start with 4 broad principles that I like to ask and that I think are important to consider. The first one being, does blockchain even make sense? Because I think that's an important threshold issue, and I think in a lot of cases, blockchain doesn't necessarily make sense. There are a whole bunch of tests out there and frameworks that various tech firms and consulting firms use. We have our own test that we use at Baker Hostetler to try to evaluate whether blockchain makes sense. I tend to think that your scenario has a lot of the elements that we look at. In particular, multiple parties that are looking to use and rely on the same data set. Benefits that could come from increasing the speed of updates to that data set. A desire for independent verification of those updates. the ability to maybe save money by cutting out a data intermediary, and then an interest and advantages to being able to automate certain transactions. And so those are the 5 principles that we look at. The one I would spot as a potential fault area would be the desire for each party to independently verify data. So it may be that in your scenario you've explained, maybe every party doesn't need to be an independent validator of that data. Maybe there is a more efficient way where everyone can trust a data intermediary to do that job. So that's one sort of high-level question I would have. Secondly, I think it's important to think about what are the technical issues that would be involved in spinning up a blockchain solution that don't have anything to do with blockchain. So in particular, there are a lot of technical issues. The one that comes to mind and that I've seen most often is data standardization that are sort of gating gateways or gating items to even being able to implement blockchain. So in other words, if you've got multiple parties that are looking to spin up a blockchain pilot, but their data isn't normalized or standardized in a way that's compatible with each other, you won't be able to get to that blockchain pilot. So there's a process there of data standardization that would have to occur first. And that's just one of several examples that are out there in terms of looking at the non-blockchain technical issues that are important. Third, what are the legal and business issues? Even if you've got a technical platform that works, it could be that there are legal and business issues specific to blockchain that could, again, operate as gating items or as inhibitors to a solution that can actually be effective in full production. I typically recommend, and I think you kind of mentioned this, is to do sort of a current state, future state type analysis where you're looking at what's currently happening, then ask yourself, how do we want to change the current state? And then ask yourself from there, what are the new business issues that are going to arise as you try to move to the future state? And what are the new legal issues that will arise as you try to do that? And that can get quite complex. And then fourthly, is really when you really get to the actual blockchain specific issue, which is to start by trying to identify what blockchain protocol is the best fit for the solution that you're looking to build. And one of the big questions there is it a private permission blockchain that makes the most sense, or a public blockchain like the Ethereum blockchain? And there are many issues that go into that analysis, and especially with a private blockchain, who's going to host those nodes? Because that triggers a lot of different business and legal issues just on its own. So that's kind of the initial framework that I use to analyze these types of situations.
So Debbie, as far as some of the solutions, like there at the end, Rob was talking about different private, public blockchains, and also about like the data normalization as like a gatekeeping into solutions. How does that comport with your thoughts, and then about some more general standardization parameters for blockchain generally?
Sure. So there's 2 ways to look at that. The first is you're looking at your industry and in which it's being used. And so is there a common language in that industry where information is entered in the supply chain and transferred among parties that are not under one roof, that are not under one company? So a lot of times that comes from consortiums. So for instance, in the insurance industry, there's some blockchain consortiums. In other industries, they're forming these consortiums, or it just might be a natural language kind of thing. It's the language that's accepted in the industry. The second common standards parameters that we have to look at is actually the blockchain itself. And there's a lot of different types of blockchains. So what is the one, the distributed ledger technology that is being used by the company that is pushing this forward, or are there a lot of different blockchains being used by different companies, in which case the language of the different blockchains may not coordinate. So that's a whole different issue. So we have 2 questions of the standardizations that we have to talk about. And so we can, I guess that's a jumping off point for Rob, if you want to take it from there, or James, if you want to jump in. Those are my 2 basic answers.
You can't mark it off Yeah, so I'm gonna toss it to Steve in a second and challenge the beginning approach. But before we leave you, Debbie, are there a couple of mainline like standardized forms for what you'd think of as blockchain? You'd say this is the approach, or this is the open source platform or format, because I'm pretty sure like Ethereum is based off of one of the open source approaches.
Right, and so that's what if Steve's blockchain is using Ethereum, absolutely, we could have that common language. But if if they're not all using Ethereum, it's not necessarily all going to match up. So I think that's the first question is, how do you get an industry to talk to one another if there's different blockchains different types of technology of DLT being involved?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, this is a supply chain conundrum, regardless of whether or not you're considering blockchain. It's just, how do you get everybody on the same page? How do you agree to measurements? How do you agree to standards? Are you using an IEEE ISO approach? That it's not surprising that this would also to deal with that. But speaking of different things to use, so Steve, what if hypothetically you had a question that said, is blockchain really the right solution we want for those instances like energy where you need to distribute it instantaneously? So as far as I know, photons always travel the same speed. You've got these ideas that, okay, well, as blockchain, you're going through, you're validating, you're checking on things. Sometimes I think this is one of the concerns with cryptocurrency. It would take a long time to validate transactions and to mine additional things. Is that a concern here, or how do you get around that if it is one?
Yeah, so certainly, and as it relates to the actual physical transactions in energy, where you're literally flipping on the light switch, so that would be more of a phase 3, phase 4 type approach. Initially, what we're considering has more to do with the intangible environmental benefits associated with energy. So it's not actually the energy itself. So that does allow for, I would say, a little bit more redundancy, where in the event we were to try to execute a transaction, something went horribly wrong, we're not, blacking out Manhattan. We're instead going to have a technical problem that we would need to fix on the back end to make sure that everyone has appropriately received what they had contracted for. And I think that all three of you have made some good points regarding standardization, and some of them are, blockchain specific questions, and some are not. In the past, there hasn't been necessarily a regulatory or a participant necessity to all agree on what goes into one type of an energy transaction, so that Texas could have a different definition than New York, which has a different definition than London, of what sort of rights are embodied in these types of credits that, of carbon credits or energy credits that we're transacting in. But as soon as you go the next step and say, okay, now we want to all transact on the same platform, you have to agree on a couple of things. One, what are the elements of the product that we are trading, and they have to be agreed upon, which is not a blockchain question. And the second is what is the underlying code that we're going to be using in order to make sure that we are transferring these credits in an appropriate way and tracking appropriately what rights are being transferred and what rights aren't. And that's a really difficult issue, because in highly regulated markets like in energy, like in financial services, you have regulators who, for very good reason, have very fixed beliefs on how these sorts of things could operate. So you really need to have a lot of people up and down the chain who have agreements on what the physical product is, as well as how the transaction process works technologically.
So Rob, have you heard complaints about whether or not well, let me take a step back. So you've walked through and you've said, okay, well, I'm going to evaluate this according to whether it's feasible. And sometimes you might have a client that's insistent that it is. And then I guess you've got to weigh the pros and cons of a technology, where all technologies have certain limitations, and certainly with the standardization, that's one. The other is just the mechanism by which it works. But Steve, and Steve's going to correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the things that you've introduced, which is a really interesting concept, is what we see in international trade sometimes too, where you have these offsets. You've got certain requirements that are more, it's less about the instant deal itself and more about the strategy and approach. So you want to do things for tax purposes. Not that you would structure anything, but you want to do things for tax purposes. You want to do things because you've got restrictions on when you can transfer. You've got a lot of different municipality restrictions and guidelines and things you have to work with too. So having good records may offset, and the desire for that, then you would be willing to take a little bit of performance hit because you don't need it necessarily to be instantaneous. These are things that are supposed to be redundant and available and reliable for what you'd use those records for.
Yeah, certainly. And what we would, a lot of the appeal in having that shared ledger is that instead of having, one centralized body that is the sole caretaker of those records, that then we would be able to empower ourselves, our clients, and others to be able to be getting data at the same time as everyone else. In a lot of ways, it's a very democratic idea in the sense that data, instead of being locked behind some sort of a firewall, would be available for everyone to view. And now in some cases, there may be good reasons why you don't have data standardization, or you have reasons why only certain people have access to data. But to the extent that if you're purely looking at a more libertarian idea of how we transact, I think that having a standardized, immutable, centrally accessible farm of data could have a lot of benefits to end-use customers who may want to know more about where their energy or where their commodities are coming from than what they traditionally might learn from the intermediaries who are giving them the information that they want, only the information they want them to have.
Picking up on that, I mean, have you seen similar discussions when you've looked at clients, and are there other reasons or other issues that are very important for them to think about when it comes to just applicability, availability of the records, and even the immediacy of the solution?
Sure. So a couple thoughts there. One of the ways I like to try to understand and advise on blockchain solutions is to ask, what exactly is the data that is proposed to being managed and used and updated and viewed on the blockchain solution? And I think at a kind of a broad level, there's really kind of two very broad classes there. One is sort of data that just takes the form of information, and so using blockchain as a means to provide parties to that blockchain better access to current accurate information. And when you're using blockchain in that way, it tends to trigger less legal issues than the other way, which is when it's actually evolving to using, transferring and storing and managing some kind of financial asset, and I'll get to that in a second. But when you're talking about just data, there are really, from a legal perspective, two main issues that I like to highlight. The first is data privacy and security issues. So, new laws like the GDPR, the CCPA, and other data privacy laws are going to apply there, as well as requirements around data security. And one of the things I like to highlight is that no blockchain solution is just blockchain. For the most part, any blockchain solution really is a combination of blockchain, personal and individual devices, and traditional databases. And in the energy sector in particular, IoT platforms, which are managed on centralized servers, are very often integrated and have been integrated in current solutions. And so you've got more than just blockchain to think about there when you're talking about how to manage and protect and adequately comply with laws and regulations around just data management and storage and transfer. Secondly, think about, like, as a blockchain solution, the idea is that you've got multiple parties that are now all have access to and use of the same data set. And that can trigger antitrust concerns. We haven't quite seen this yet. However, we have seen the two, as an example, we have seen the two blockchain consortia groups that have been spun up to manage shipping containers have both recently received antitrust exemptions. And so, you can see that issue has been at play there. And I think, you as you're building a solution that's built to scale and to grow properly, you want to keep antitrust issues in mind in terms of who has access to what data, and does that potentially bump up against the antitrust rules. When you're talking about now the second category, which I would call, generally speaking, a financial asset, that's where the legal analysis becomes much more complicated. I say this all the time to clients and contacts. Here in the US, we have 4 different regulatory agencies that define cryptographic assets in 4 different ways. So we have the IRS defining cryptocurrencies as property, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network as money. The SEC defines them largely as securities with some exceptions. And then the CFTC defines them as commodities. So when you're building a platform that evolves to the point where it is capable of actually being a host for certain types of financial assets, there are a lot of legal issues that you will have to deal with before you can really go live with that type of solution in an effective manner. So I hope that helps in terms of sort of identifying some of the big picture legal issues that I think are at play in some of these solutions. And I think there are more that are a little bit more specific to the energy industry, and we can get into that.
So Debbie, jumping off from what Rob was talking about here, where you've got, a concept / platform that's both a particle and a wave. It could mean different things to different people. And if you have a situation like Steve's outlining here, where part of the reason why you'd want to use the blockchain might be to answer regulator questions, to point them to the golden record or the proof of the transaction to show why things are legit. How would you spend a couple minutes and explain how you would help a regulator access a platform and see what this information is? How would you prove it up, giving something that objectively should be able to, but subjectively may be brand new as far as technologies and approach?
Right. What's really interesting is regulators are finally, we're at the point a few years down the road where they understand the value of the blockchain, and they understand that it's this immutable, permanent record for the most part. And so, if they're built the way a regulator would like to see, if they're built from scratch, they'll have the date and timestamp. So a blockchain, actually, one of the reasons I got so involved in it, coming from the legal industry, is because it's this perfect technology to be transparent and to show the regulators every incident that has happened. Incident meaning any interaction, anything that happened along that supply chain. So it's permanent. It's transparent. It's also, as Rob was just talking about, it's secure. It's very difficult to hack. And a regulator can have real-time access, so everybody's interacting with it. There's not a lot of other technologies that have all the characteristics that the blockchain has. So to answer your question, James, a little more specifically in terms of, you really need to build it out first among your partners, among your parties. Once you've proved it and built it out, then you can allow the portals for the regulators to have access, and you don't give them access to everything. You give them limited access to what they need to see. And limited access could be great. It just depends on what the regulator needs to see. I've been in a lot of discussions about what that means and what information fields they need to see. And again, the language of the regulator has to be the same language of data points. We talked about this earlier, of the supply chain. They have to, otherwise they wouldn't have the right access. But you give them this portal to be able to, whether it's real time, whether it's in hours. But right now, the way it works in a lot of industries is that you get notice that a regulator is going to audit you, and then you have to prepare your documents for audit, and you have a regulator sit in your when we flew, sit in your office, give them a table in the front room. And with blockchain, you could give them access from the comfort of their home, real time, to be able to look at records. It's an incredible opportunity to be able to have regulation over almost any industry that uses blockchain.
So part of the magic is allowing the regulators to audit the solution from the comfort of their own home basements, per se. So I guess, right. So it's interesting. Please, Steve.
Yeah, I would say too that I think that Debbie hits on a good point there, is that since you can automate compliance functions, that would actually be a pretty nice win from the perspective of the regulated entity. Now, you may have confidentiality concerns, but earlier Rob had mentioned the CFTC is one of the regulators who regulates different swaps and derivatives transactions. There are all sorts of CFTC reporting requirements that parties must comply with in the event they enter into a derivative transaction. To the extent that you could have a node on your blockchain that the regulator could access and audit the transaction itself, or that you as a regulated entity would be able to set up a system in which the appropriate regulator or execution facility automatically receives that data, that then would potentially be able to eliminate some of the risk of just data transcription errors, or the error that someone sitting at the person who needs to do something doesn't do it properly, or that they just make a mistake. And so there is the potential there for a nice automated compliance solution.
And I'll just add on to that, James, that, we're really, at least in my view, we're really seeing kind of, I'd say 3 different approaches there in general. One, as Steve mentioned, is to actually allow a regulator to actually run a node on a private permissioned blockchain. Another would be a private permission blockchain where you may be allowing the regulator to run a node, but you're giving them real-time viewing access, as Debbie mentioned. And there are certain benefits and detriments to both of those approaches. And then a third approach that has emerged is to integrate a private blockchain with a public blockchain, so that every so often, periodically, data from that private blockchain is batched and written to a public blockchain, maybe in some kind of redacted form, and then providing anyone has access to that public blockchain. It's usually Ethereum in the way that this solution's been used. And I think with any of those 3 approaches, they all kind of accomplish what we weren't necessarily able to accomplish before, which is a reliable real-time record made available to the people that have an interest in seeing some of that data. But then from kind of a more practical legal perspective, any of those 3 approaches or any other approaches that you come up with are going to have real-world contractual agreements that kind of define some of the metes and bounds around that data transfer and access. So just a follow-on thought there.
So Steve, you and Debbie are in the conference room. You're presenting to other people within your organization, not really your organization, but for the purposes of the webinar. And they're questioning you. They are not steeped in blockchain. And I'd like to say, for all the people watching the webinar right now, be appreciative that this was not a blockchain 101. This assumed a lot of information. We're diving in. But let's take it back now. Let's let those people get a chance to catch their breaths. So you're in that boardroom now, and you've got some of the SVPs who are in marketing or advertising or sales, or who are concerned with this and have certain reporting responsibilities, or at least responsibilities overall to it, say, okay, but break it down a little bit for me at this point. You had said you've got nodes. You're saying that we can have different types of reporting out. Is this just function like a big database of our transaction that's a little bit more secure, or are there fundamental differences here that I need to appreciate but that haven't been conveyed yet?
So let's take it. Do you want me to start?
Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah,
go
I
ahead,
was just going
Debbie.
to say, I don't know if we need to start from the point that the blockchain is like a tree. That it's a tree, this is the most basic. The most basic form of way of thinking about it is, some people think about it as a chain of information that's built upon each other. Sometimes you're not going to be able to hear me, but sometimes people think of it as a tree that has different branches that you can have different, you can have a main blockchain, which is the trunk, and then different branches that come off with different information. And I think people need to understand the most basic aspect of it before we can even go on to what that means. So James, I don't know if that's even where you were going with that, of how the blockchain is built and the information and the privacy of the information, but I definitely make sure I'd start with that, because the thing that comes to me most from executives in a boardroom is they're worried about the privacy of their information, and they think everybody's going to have access, either it's all public or it's the accessibility of that information and who has access to it. So I explain those branches are limited to whoever you give access to, and the trunk might be more public. You might have more information on it.
Yeah, and so an analogy that I tend to use, in that kind of that boardroom SVP style, is that it's almost like you have a Google sheet where you have different parties are able to input data into the chain, and there are certain sorts of rules that indicate who is permissioned, who is allowed to make those entries, and what sort of format the entry needs to be in order for it to be validly accepted onto your hypothetical Google sheet. And so, but at the end of the day, you also don't have Google. You don't have a party in the middle that has the sole right in order to make changes to how you go about entering that information and what is valid and what is not, and then could conceivably take the whole spreadsheet down and just say, I've decided to stop allowing people to do this, or I can then take access myself to certain sorts of privileged information that no one else has. And so it's in some ways, it's a distributed Google sheet. And, and Rob and Debbie could probably tell me where that analogy might break down in some ways, but at least that's the way I'll explain it conceptually to try and get people to level set.
So I want to return to something that Debbie had spoken about at the beginning, and I think I tried to introduce this concept, and it was one of my mute times. But Debbie, you'd said that I think some of your interests came out of the mortgage world, and there were some, certainly around like the CDO, the collateralized debt obligations, the collateralized loan obligations, this idea where suddenly if there was money to be made, you could slice and dice different things in different ways. That's fantastic, especially when you start to get to where you can rate things and end up putting things in different buckets, different tranches. However, the record keeping was just abysmal. And you ended up with people keeping track of ownership of different parts of mortgages on Excel spreadsheets that were then emailed back and forth, and you never knew really, an error in one, a missort, copy and paste that was off, and suddenly your field was over.
Right.
I heard that one of the interesting use cases, at least initially for blockchain, was, to Steve's point, where you had a business need that needed better record keeping, even if it wasn't necessarily for an auditor. So it was dark pool trading, where you had these ideas that you didn't need to send trades outside of a brokerage house. You had your different constituent clients that wanted to trade or could trade among each other, but you needed to have really good records in case something inadvertently went wrong. And compared to the Google spreadsheets or other companies who might have spreadsheet programs, where you do have some concerns about certainly data integrity, the golden record, who has what and what time. And now you've got a situation where it's really tough to beat the immutability of the data collection mechanism within blockchain. So, Rob, we're going to kick it to you because I've introduced some concepts, Steve's introduced some concepts. You can tell us why we're all wrong and why it's all going to go south. And now we're going to need Debbie's help as far as like how we're going to frame our response to the regulators when they're asking why things went so wrong.
Well, I think that what everyone has just said in terms of the key point to communicate at the boardroom level is absolutely correct. It's this idea of data immutability, the idea that you can now create a record where the record cannot be updated unless all parties agree to the update. And those parties can be selected through a private permissioned only group. And then once that data is entered, it can't be changed. No one can alter it. You'd have to tear down the entire blockchain in order to alter it. And so that, I think, that really is the key issue from a boardroom perspective. I guess the other one I would highlight is the enhanced data security. So you think about a blockchain that maybe has 10 nodes on it, as compared to a centralized database with only one host. With that centralized database, it's very susceptible to hacks. And once a hack happens, you've
I think Rob got so excited about that one point that his connection froze up. Okay, we are 2 for 4 now. So Debbie, as far as like an explanation to the board, I think this idea of data security by data fidelity and being able to go back and reference specific records is a really important one. Has that come up much in discussions that you've had?
Been attacked and there's no going back.
Rob's back. All right, Debbie?
Yeah. So, James, reiterate in terms of explaining to the board, it was explaining exactly what, just so I make sure I understand we're on the same page.
So I think it's it's one thing to make sure the technology works, and I think unless you correct me, like the blockchain technology is not a new thing. It's not a fundamentally complex. It could be quantitatively complex. There could be a lot of moving parts, but
Right.
the qualitative component of it, it's not like machine learning or some of the other buzzwords that get tossed around in like legal and other advanced tech fields. Like right now, this is an established approach to you want to call it double entry accounting, but you could look at it like it's double entry accounting. You've got different ways in which you can check the
Got
fidelity
it.
of a record.
Got it. Yeah.
Even though there's an unknown, it's like explaining it and saying this is why it's protected in that way. And I don't know, Steve, have you had concerns from people where they talk about the access to the data, how you make sure you know what it is? It seems like a lot of the concerns wouldn't be about the accuracy of the information if everybody's able to check it, but it's does everybody get to check it, and what does that mean for data security or the use of it?
So was that a question for me or was that for Rob?
Let's stick it to you first, and then Rob will correct my question anyway.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of access to information, I mean, certainly there are concerns. I mean, these are markets where if you're not talking about a public exchange of a market, parties who are trading in these markets have proprietary information and that they want to keep as to what their portfolio is, because you don't want someone to be able to know exactly what it is you have and what it is you need, because they might be able to effectively weaponize that information against you and try to anticipate your move before you do. So there are trade-offs behind this sort of democratization of data to where it becomes available to anyone who has access to the shared ledger, and also parties who might want to keep their proprietary access to the information that they want to keep. I mean, it's in, if you look at the financial services industry, certainly there are a lot of parties who would be, very concerned if all of their other trading counterparties knew what they were going to do and then conceivably might be able to map out what they would do next. So there's both. So the democratization of the data is a double-edged sword where everyone gets access to it, but at the same time, you may be revealing things you might have an interest in not revealing.
So I guess, Rob, this probably doesn't sound surprising to you. I know that several years ago, all the buzz was around the cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin became synonymous for a while with blockchain, and it's tough to disambiguate that, depending if that's where you're getting your news. But it seems like as some of the buzz has receded, there's been a slow but consistent adoption within different clients and across these different use cases, because this does fit a need, it fits a niche. And to Steve's point about democratizing data, there might be some other areas where we would expect that we'd see even more. So when it comes to, let's say, autonomous driving vehicles, there's an approach here where he says you want to collect all that information. You want all the cars to be informed, because the better informed each car is, the better they interact together. And I don't know if you've seen that in other industries, kind of this like the slow accretion or acceptance of this, because it fits a good use case. Even if you don't have the buzz with it, then you just see people using it because it's effective and it works properly.
Yeah, and a lot of those use cases do not involve public blockchains. They involve private instances of, in a lot of cases, Hyperledger, and there are a lot of different protocols within Hyperledger. But some examples that come to mind as Steve was talking, one in particular, a project that I was involved in, had to do with a solution that is currently being built for the financial markets for, again, a private group of participants, where the blockchain really only comes in one, really one small part of the solution. And in that piece, data that is shared by several participants is written to a blockchain, a private blockchain, in encrypted form. And the idea with that solution was that a regulator would have access to that data, so that if there were ever an issue around who had access to what data at what point in time, that blockchain could serve as a backup to show that certain data was accessible by a certain group of parties all at the same time, and that it would be time-stamped as to when the data was delivered. And again, the idea is that the regulator would actually have access, would run a node on that blockchain. So that's an example of where, it's a very specific use case that does seem to solve a problem around data auditability. To take it back to IoT devices, one of the things that really excites me about what's happening in the energy markets is the combination of blockchain and IoT that can potentially allow, and some pilots have already started doing this, allow off-grid energy sources to sort of integrate with the on-grid energy providers. And it's done by, syncing up IoT devices to those off-grid energy sources, and then having the data around the energy that they've captured, whether it's they have an access or a deficiency, and then writing that to a blockchain that is shared, with the energy grid provider, so that now you have a situation where the on-grid folks and the off-grid folks can start to communicate and potentially, find better sources to better allocate energy from both sources. So those are both examples where, again, it's by and large, a private permission blockchain that is being used, and where it's being integrated just as a really just a small piece of a much larger, much more traditional technical solution that involves some other emerging technologies like IoT.
So that called to mind my next bad metaphor of this this panel. It sounds like you've got some really good use cases too, as far as standardization in those instances where you've got people who want to collaborate on a platform, who are going to be joining an existing community. So I thought of like the ham radio operators, where if you buy the set, you want to engage in that. This is pre-internet, obviously, or maybe now, if for those or radio operators in our audience. Hi, guy. So you come aboard, you establish the protocols, you learn the language, you learn how to interact, and you build that up in time. Something like this with the energy space, if you've got these off-grid people, they're going to make investments. You say, okay, well, I'm going to use this type of technology, I'm going to link in, and for me to link in appropriately, for this to work, then I have to understand the standards and I have to accept them. But of course, Steve, from your perspective then, and I think, Debbie, you've probably seen with your clients too, the easier you make it for people to link in, the easier you make that standardization, the more likely to have the uptake. I think that was the Tesla model with the patents for how you were going to charge vehicles and the batteries. It's like, well, if we want to build a nationwide charging network, we have to incentivize people to use the same standards. And the way that we do that is by giving it to them. We don't hide it behind a paywall and require the different codec or whatever it would be. So Steve, you're nodding because that was brilliant on my part and you want to support all of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, very, very well. I wish I could have said it so eloquently myself, but it gets to a point too, is that there are switching costs, in the sense that any time you want to go from one sort of platform to another, even if it's an objectively or technologically better platform, people's brains are built to memorize what has been trained to memorize what has happened before. And so you need to have a very compelling use case to say, this is a new thing that you should invest in understanding this new thing because it will let us do things we haven't done before. And that's where a lot of projects, you may reach a point where you have achieved some sort of technical validation in what you're able to do, but then there's also the sociological and cultural element of just saying, can we convince everyone that they now need to migrate onto this new platform?
So Debbie, aside from being brilliant and eloquent yourself, how do you convince people that the blockchain is the right solution? Assuming it is, of course. What do you find the most effective way to convey that? Is it by metaphor? Is it by laying out the tech? Is it by having people use it or developing use cases or pilots? Like, how do you introduce that concept where you might have some resistance, or how do you temper it, like Rob has to sometimes, where someone's like, I want to do this, and you're like, well, let's make sure it's right for you.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So my company, I didn't talk about this at the beginning, but basically we do three things: education, and consultation. And the reason we have to do education is because our customers need to understand what are the use cases and what is it appropriate for. And I have had people come and say to me, for years, of course, we talked about blockchain being Bitcoin. People didn't understand the difference. We've gotten beyond that. So now I ask them, what is the information that you have in your supply chain, the information, what you're building, that is repeated over and over again, that needs to be used by multiple parties, that perhaps needs to be audited, that is maybe checked by multiple parties. And I get them thinking about what they do in their industry or in their business where blockchain might be appropriate. So it's not for every business, but if you can answer those questions, what is that information? So again, I said at the beginning, I deal mostly in mortgage. In the mortgage industry, the borrowers, the homeowner, the borrower's name, of course, there's private information as well, the address, the title insurance information. All that information is used by multiple parties in many different parts of the home mortgage process. And that would be from the homeowner to buy the home, and when the lender's making their loan, and when that loan is looked at by a title company, and when there's an appraiser looking at it, and when that loan is sold to the secondary market. So there's information that is used by many different parties. And so again, I get the customer to look at their business and try and figure that out. And if that doesn't exist, then basically if they use it once, I had one time where they said, we use it and we destroy it. We never use it again. And I said, well, then blockchain is just completely not appropriate for you. Why would you even be going down this road? So that does happen. You have to kind of understand their business to be able to help them.
And Rob, how often do you decline really giving advice if you just recognize that it's not the right application, if they're looking at it in the wrong way, or you just have to fundamentally change what their approach is in order to give them effective advice?
What I've seen most often, in 2+ years of legal practice, specifically focused on the industry, is not necessarily that concepts won't work or shouldn't be implemented, but instead that the folks putting the concept together haven't fully thought through how complex it might be to actually get it to the point where it's really starting to add the value that they envision. And maybe, I'm sure part of this is just my lawyer's background, but I think a lot of that does have to do with the legal issues involved in getting multiple parties to co-host a shared data set. So the benefit really, and we've talked about this in a lot of different ways, but another way to put it is the benefit is really data reconciliation, and a better way to reconcile data amongst parties. Where it gets complex is the idea that by creating this sort of shared record amongst various parties, some of which may be competitors, and doing it in a way where the data cannot be altered or changed or deleted, even if, let's say, for example, you get a deletion request under the GDPR. There are a lot of issues that have to be thought through in order to make it work. But I think one of the reasons why it's all worthwhile is that if it can work, and you do have this sort of this shared data set amongst a private group of parties that all have an interest in it and that are all co-hosting it, you now have a new data set that not only can be used for whatever solution you've used it for, but it's also a data set that can be that you can use to derive all sorts of new valuable information. And again, that can be kind of a legal minefield, but if it's navigated correctly, there's all sorts of additional value on top of the solution and the data reconciliation that can come from that. But in order to really realize that, you've really got to start thinking about some of these issues from the very beginning, especially as you're negotiating with your counterparties that you're involved with in spinning up these private blockchain consortia groups.
So we're going to return to our mortgage example. We've got a question here about the utilization of blockchain and this idea of transparency, or at least potentially transparent records, and certainly the immutability and good audit practices associated with them. So where you've got industries, and I mean, a lot of industries have, they're built up, at least their records of the practices of the past. So, you know, Debbie, without going too deeply into the past of like redlining and concerns about how mortgages were offered and different things. So this is the concern that I've heard, because you're able to have better records. You can look at what actually happens. But one of the other challenges then with this type of record keeping is, if you're looking at applications forward, if you're a good behavioral economist, you're using the information that's generated. The best predictor of behavior is people's behavior. It's not the classical economics model of what people would do, it's what people actually do. And I'm sure, Steve, within the industry, energy industry, it's not like, oh, someone's going to be good about this stuff. They're going to use the electricity they use. I mean, the best example of what you're going to do this summer was last summer. The best example of an industrial plant is going to be the economic predictors. So do you see this as a solution, or ways in which it could benefit, you know, the concerns about promulgating the problems of the past, like clear things that are clearly illegal that list to that? Or is blockchain more, it's the computer, it's the standard, it's, you know, well, you can see where I'm going. There's a lot packed into a question like that, but I wondered if you had some thoughts. So Debbie first.
Yeah, the question I hear is a little bit about, and came from one of our audience members a little bit too, is about predatory lending and how blockchain would have an effect upon that. And so let me just take that first. I don't know that blockchain, neither here nor there, has a future effect, and that except for the information gathering. It does have a very transparent and accurate, I guess, way to collect information. So from a reporting perspective, absolutely, you could see where they're going and how have they been doing it, and how have they been tracking where they issue loans, and if there's a predatory lending type of thing going on. But it's not, I wouldn't say that's the ideal use case. It can help. The one thing I do want to mention is there's other technologies that question sparks in my mind, because people always talk about AI with respect to predatory lending, because that absolutely could potentially have bias. And so I don't know that it's really that applicable, like I said, except for the reporting part of it.
So we did have one other question, and Rob, you had touched on it briefly with GDPR compliance, and where you've got GDPR or CCPA concerns, especially along the ideas of managing data. One of the beauties of different blockchain applications is that you are creating immutable records. One of the challenges for regimes where you're required to delete information or not utilize it is that you've created an immutable record. So to points that Steve, Debbie, and Rob have all made during this conversation, you want to think about the outcome here. Everything you put there on the node is going to be available. Now you can create permissions around it, but getting rid of specific things can become more difficult. I mean, you have to verify, you have to worry about how those records go. You know, we've seen utilization of things like tokenization to match up with the node, so that you've got a good record, but there are certain parts of the record then that are offline or off the blockchain that you would have references for. Now you lose some of the golden record aspect of it. You can't just pick it up wholesale and have everything available to you, but then you do increase some of the efficacy, where if you've got information out there, it's not personal information, it's a reference to some other piece. Is that wrong? Because I'm riffing based on my understanding, and I want to turn over to the experts. So who wants to raise their hand and prove why that was just way off? All right, Rob, thank you. Sold.
No, I mean, this is an issue that I find fascinating. As you know, James, we've done quite a bit of work in this area. And it's, I think, in brief, I would say the GDPR issues, and in particular, like the right to erasure, are tricky. But certainly not insurmountable. But it's definitely one of the key issues that, to the extent any blockchain is going to deal with anything resembling personal data, it's something that you need to think about before you start building. And that's where I think it really pays off to have the lawyers working hand in hand with the technology providers, so that you can understand how something's being architected, and we've experienced this in some instances, work with the tech folks to actually redesign some of the technical architecture so that it can be more GDPR compliant. The key thing that I like to focus on there is, and I brought this up before, but it's this idea that no blockchain solution is just blockchain. It's data that's being housed on a blockchain, as well as personal devices, as well as traditional databases, and actually also in non-traditional databases like things like IPFS. And so I know we've only got about a minute left, but I think I'll just wrap that up by saying some of the key concept there is to manage the data so that the data that needs to be deleted, if it has to be, is not on the blockchain, but rather is in one of those other areas.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for their participation in this this panel. We've gotten some notes that people were very appreciative that it was not another blockchain 101, and also about the knowledge level of the panels. Hopefully we brought it down enough. But certainly, if there's any other questions that people have, our contact information is available through the Masters Conference, or we're all available on LinkedIn. We're all happy to speak with you. Steve's going to do it out on the patio with a drink, but still. So thank you guys. Thanks everybody, and so long.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.